Hey, it's your boy Cosmic here, and today I decided to make a basic Superzak guide since he's the only character I play that I haven't made a video on yet. Now, Superzak's game plan is at its core fairly simple. He wants to get in and get in fast. Despite the fact that his entire game plan can be summed up, well, like that, and this game doesn't exactly have a shortage of rushdown characters, there are a few things he does that make him feel very different from the rest of the cast, which is what I'll be going over in this video, starting with how to use each of his moves. First of all, this uppercut is not good. It does chip damage, which means it can be good for getting rid of that last bit of health, but if you're close enough to use it, you'd probably be better off just using a throw instead, and if you need a quick anti-air, aerial Zag kick will usually be either just as or more effective. Speaking of which, this move is part of what makes Super Zack feel so unique, and it's actually really good. There are three main things it's useful for, those being as an escape tool, an anti-air, and approach tool, which is a pretty varied list for a move this simple. All three of these uses are fairly self-explanatory, so instead of going into more detail on them, I've decided to go over some unique little quirks this move has. First of all, you might have noticed that when I use it, it sometimes goes straight down and sometimes floats above the ground for a bit, and despite feeling like the input should be slightly different for both of these, the version you get is dependent on if you do it at the peak of the jump or at any other time. Generally speaking, the one that you get at the peak of the jump is better as an approach tool, and the one you get at any other time is better for escaping pressure, and both can work equally well as anti-airs. The second thing that this move does is a somewhat useless technique called funny bouncing. Basically, if you hold the back button and press A on the frame that you land, you can do an extra bounce in the same direction you were going already. This might seem useful at first, but the input is actually frame perfect, as if you press A even a single frame later, you'll just use the ground as that kick and go towards the opponent, and chances are if you're trying to funny bounce, you want to get away from the opponent, so this is, yeah, it's not ideal. Speaking of which, there's also the grounded Zag kick, which despite being technically the same move as the aerial variant, actually functions pretty differently in most regards, the main one being that it's way worse as an approach tool. Since to my knowledge it always does that extra little hover thing before it lands, it's really easy to punish on block even if it's used from full screen range. It's also a much worse anti-air and is only as good at escaping pressure as the aerial version. But despite all of this, it still has its uses. First of all, due to the fact that it goes up slightly, if your opponent throws a projectile, it'll almost always go over said projectile, and usually hits the opponent before their recovery animation is ended, so that's one really good thing about it. Its other main use is as a follow-up attack after the aerial variant, which isn't that good by itself, but if you use it enough, you can force the opponent to guess if you're going to approach or not, and if they guess incorrectly, you either get an easy punish and some extra damage, or extra time to set things up while they're blocking. Speaking of setting things up, as if Superzak wasn't already different from the rest of this game's rushdown characters, he has a projectile. Despite seeming like it wouldn't work on a character like this, Superzak's projectile is actually one of the more useful ones in the game. As with all projectiles, you can use the down, back, and down forward inputs to change its speed, and like every minor variation on all of Superzak's abilities, the three projectile speeds are all used for different things. Probably the most linear one is the fast projectile, which is only really used if the opponent is knocked down from full screen range in order to keep him in block stun to continue pressure. Despite not being used for anything other than this, the fast projectile is still really good at the one thing it does, so I wouldn't want to completely write it off. It's just very linear. The fast and medium projectiles, on the other hand, are actually fairly similar in their uses, as they're mostly used to pressure the opponent and make a lot of options much safer than they would normally be. The medium projectile is a bit more linear, and I personally only use it for this, but unlike the fast projectile, I wouldn't be surprised if someone in the future ended up using it for more than just this. You'll just have to find out what that use could be yourself. The slow one is much more varied in its uses, and it actually has so many applications once it's out, most of which are bizarrely situational, that I couldn't possibly go over them myself. The two main situations where you'd want to set it up are from full screen when you're on neutral, and as an Oki tool from mid-screen range, though. Overall, I find the slow projectile to be the most useful, as it's the one that 9 times out of 10 works best for doing cool pressure setups. But one thing you should note about it is the fact that if you use Zag Kick right after setting it up, it'll get scrolled off screen and disappear, but that's the closest thing to a drawback that it has. Now that I've gone over all of Superzak's specials and his basic game plan, I'm going to use this part of the video to talk about some stuff he does that's at least worth noting, but I couldn't fit anywhere else. First of all, quite possibly the worst thing about this character is his extremely low stun value. Because of this, if you so much as look at him in a way he doesn't like, he gets stunned, and that makes pressuring him extremely easy. After all, what's a mediocre escape tool going to do when you get stunned during the only chances you have to use it? This doesn't make Superzak unplayable or even really that bad, but it's definitely something you should be aware of if you're looking to pick him up. The next thing I wanted to mention is this. That's right, Superzak has an infinite, because if anyone needed it, it was Superzak. It can be pretty difficult to do and doesn't give you much damage, but in theory you could get a knockdown at the start of the round, and if you're close enough you could get rid of the opponent's entire health bar just by doing this. The way it works is that since when the opponent gets up, you're behind them, they can't block on frame 1, and if you use Superzak's GP, a move that covers the area behind him at the start, you can knock them down again and just keep doing that. Now, if you can't do this, that's fine, you don't need to. In fact, I can't even do it myself, as you've probably noticed by now, and yet I'm still capable of getting decent results with this character, so don't feel the need to spend hours in practice mode doing something you don't really want to do. Last thing I want to go over is his normals, and they're fine, I guess. Punch is bad, as usual, and GP isn't really useful outside of the infinite, and while there's nothing wrong with Kick, I personally never find myself using it. He does have a few really good normals, though, those being Air Punch and Sweep. Air Punch isn't exceptional, but it has good range and decent damage, so it can work well as a spacing tool. Like Kick, I pretty much never use it, but unlike Kick, I could see it having some real potential. Just not potential I'm willing to go into, because playing Superzak as a spacing character is not something I ever want to have to do in my life. By far his best normal, though, is Sweep. Unlike every other sweep in the game, this one comes out really fast and recovers just as quickly, so you know what that means, oh! Or if you're a tiny baby like me, you could use that time to set up a projectile instead, I don't know. So, yeah, that's about it for my Superzak guide. This is usually the part where the funny YouTube man tells you to like and subscribe, but since I'm not a soulless husk, I'm just gonna use this part of the video to say that we should ban guys.